Ora si registrerà la conferenza.
I'll try to live up to his standards. I'd like to point out at the outset, however, that this subject is, of course, I think everybody would agree, the subject is very broad, very deep. It's being addressed continuously and has been for quite some time at so many conferences, in so many articles, books, on so many university campuses, in the media, and so forth. So in our time together, I hope that we can visit the top line, as it were, of the critical issues involved in this subject. And at the outset, I would also suggest that we might address three streams, as it were. The first is the very timeliness of this discussion, even today, because there are a number of anniversaries, as it were, that are taking place in this field. Organizations that have been working hard at it for quite some time, and I'll go into some detail on that in just a few minutes. But at the same time, as we catch our breath, as it were, and look forward, we are really at the cusp of what I would call the troublesome, turbulent 2020s. The events that are occurring and will be occurring certainly in the next year and beyond that, many of them are truly historic. And so this subject is being addressed within the context of a very fluid society. So that's one stream that we'll visit. The second stream is the great significance of corporate social responsibility, and it is called other things, of course, corporate citizenship, sustainable development, and so forth. But the great significance of this discussion, because let's face it, business, global business, of course, is a hyperpower in the way society functions. And whether or not it is evolving in some responsible way is a subject that is of great weight, I think, in many, many different directions. So I will offer a spoiler, as it were, right at the outset. The answer to the question in the title is corporate social responsibility, and the answer to the way in which capitalism is being criticized. My answer would be it is an answer, but it is certainly not the answer. There is so much more to be done within this great field of endeavor. And then the third stream that I hope to visit with our guest today is indeed the great opportunity, but the great challenges that come to the public relations profession and to communications executives around the world as a result of the way in which society is evolving and the way in which I would contend that business through corporate social responsibility is evolving and can evolve in that connection. So maybe we could start, with just a moment or two on the timeliness of it. Let me be a little bit more specific on that stream. It happens that as I said, there are anniversaries of organizations that have been working in this field for quite some time. One of which is, of course, the World Economic Forum. And I'm going to read to you briefly, very briefly, a full-page ad that the World Economic Forum has just run in major newspapers and other outlets, okay? And the headline on this is, "A Company's Purpose in the Fourth Industrial Revolution." It says this: 50 years ago, the World Economic Forum founded on the notion that the corporations not only have a duty to their shareholders, but they also have a responsibility to all of their stakeholders, including society at large. The Fourth Industrial Revolution profoundly affects the way in which we live and work. The forum's 50th annual meeting will build on the original manifesto, introducing a new statement on what it means for business to serve the world in the 21st century. The World Economic Forum's initiatives over the last 50 years have improved the lives of millions of people. They demonstrate that embracing stakeholder responsibility in all of its forms is the foundation for a more cohesive, inclusive, and sustainable world. Now, in addition to the World Economic Forum, there are a couple of other developments that go to the timeliness of this topic, one of which is the 20th anniversary of the United Nations Global Compact, which was established in 2001 by Kofi Annan at that time. And I consider that to be a watershed in the evolution of corporate social responsibility, because it was the first time that somebody central to societal development endeavored to bring together the many forces that could be effective in helping in some way to improve global society. And today, 10 years from that establishment, the UN Global Compact has almost 10,000 companies around the world, plus 4,000 associated members. And those are NGOs, academic institutions, governments, etc. And all of these organizations have pledged to work in terms of a society improvement related to 10 different activities, and they cluster in human rights and labor and environment and anti-corruption. So the 10th anniversary of the United Nations Global Compact, I think, is relevant. And then thirdly, in that connection, the United Nations, as I'm sure all the folks on this program will know, endeavors over the next several years to further improve society in terms of the pursuit of 17 major societal objectives. Some say that's too many, but my point is that if all of those objectives are not totally achieved, or only some of them are totally achieved, wouldn't it be wonderful if we had at least 50% reduction in poverty and the health problems and gender equity and environment and so forth, which are included in those 17 objectives? So I believe that our chat today is indeed timely, and that stream is something that will be going on clearly from today forward. So with that, go ahead.
Yes, and next decade will be crucial for the implementation of corporate social responsibility behavior and policies around the world.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, there are many other initiatives by individual companies and by subgroups, as it were, industry by industry. The extractive industries has an association that is working on this. The banking industry has its Equator principles on lending responsibly and so forth. These are all attempts to move forward on the question of how this great hyperpower, as it were, business, can in some way contribute to societal progress. It is imperfect. There are many, many problems in regard. There is much work, and we'll get to it in a few minutes, in terms of what I think really needs to be undertaken in a new phase of corporate social responsibility. But moving on to the second stream, as it were, the significance, to me at least, of this discussion is the fact that with those efforts, imperfect as they may be, incomplete as they may be, they are nevertheless, I believe, genuine. But they come at a time when capitalism itself, as our topic says, is truly under fire. And so we have discussions of capitalism versus socialism, for example. It seems to me that that discussion and discussions like capitalism is dead or dying or needs tremendous reform miss out on the fact that capitalism in its many different species over the decades and even centuries has been evolving. And I look at this as a phase of further evolution of capitalism. I mean, we're not going to go back to the 1600s with the British East India Company, nor stop any way along the line up until the present. But the point simply is that I think it's useful, at least, to consider that this is an opportunity for a new phase of evolution of capitalism. And it has many problems it has to address in terms of its reputation, in terms of the way it is perceived, the way it acts in many ways, and things like accusations about the inequality in society, very, very serious, that need to be considered in this evolution. The corruption that exists around the world, the political upheavals, the divisions that have emerged, especially in the last few years. These are all very, very difficult elements within society and within this discussion. So I think that the significance is clear in terms of the impact of a more progressive business philosophy that I think we're going to be discussing over the next few minutes. I would repeat again that corporate social responsibility is seen to have a number of synonyms: sustainable development, for example, sustainability, and these are all attempts, I think, to re-articulate what the term corporate social responsibility means. But we'll use CSR as our means of moving forward. It's a little bit easier than trying to deal with all of the synonyms. So in the significant stream, again, there are so many stakeholders that have a right to be considered, and the problems and the opportunities that exist with them. But I would suggest that in the interest of time, we just very quickly allude to what I might call the three major stakeholders within private enterprise, certainly, within business as a whole. And those three would be the investors, the employees, and the customers or consumers that business has to keep very much in mind if indeed it is going to address stakeholder management, and stakeholder communications as well. So very, very quickly, let's talk about investors, okay? Because something very interesting has been happening in the last 5 years certainly, and that is the growth of what is called socially responsible investing. Here is what the Wall Street Journal said about that not too long ago. It said that, here's my note, according to recent research, at the end of the year 2017, more than 1 out of every $4 under professional management in the United States, $12 trillion or more, was invested according to socially responsible strategies. Now, what are those strategies? Socially responsible investing started mainly in terms of a negative basis. It was mainly people who would want certainly a return on investment, but wanted their investments not to be supportive of what those investors thought to be negative in terms of society. So that would be perhaps weapons companies. At the time, it was tobacco and alcohol and a number of subjective decisions as to if you're managing my money, please don't invest in those kinds of industries and companies. More recently, however, the flip has occurred, and many investors are looking at the possibility and the desirability of finding companies that have excellent, or at least acceptable, good records in terms of the issues in society. And so companies that are working hard and communicating their progress, their commitments to, for example, climate change and environmental protections and so forth, gender equality, and a number of other social responsibility commitments in terms of how a company runs its business. These are investors who, again, want an acceptable return on investment, but include that kind of standards in their desirability to invest. And I think that's very important. I would say that just 2 days ago, I read this. This was the communique from the Madrid UN Climate Conference. It says this: more than 600 institutional investors managing a whopping 37 trillion in client assets called for governments to step up to their efforts against climate change. The investors, including banks, pension funds, and insurance companies, directed their message to countries participating in that meeting. So what we're seeing is a broadening of the base in the investing community in terms of the commitments that are now being expected by investors. Now, from a business point of view, the other aspect of this that I think is very important is that many companies are now coming to the realization that certain impacts from various social issues, like climate change especially, have an effect on their potential performance, success, and reputations. Risk management is now become a very important, it's always been important in management, of course, but it is becoming a far more important element because investors want to know what are companies doing to prepare for the possibility of various impacts from climate change. So that is an aspect of socially responsible investing that I think that we can't ignore. It's very important. Biagio, I'd like to move on now to the
Let's go.
Employees.
Yes, on the employees' voice, please.
Okay, some very interesting things have been happening in connection with corporate social responsibility with employees in various companies. For one thing, employees at some of the social media giants have banded together in a number of cases to protest the use of the products that they develop and market by, quote, unacceptable customers. For example, the use of some sophisticated social media services and products by the military. On another plane, some employees at companies like this and other companies have protested the way in which management has handled or mishandled, in their judgment, sexual harassment and other harassment aspects of it. The point being that the workforce of the day and the future is not by any means, of course, the workforce of 20 or 50 or 100 years ago. For the most part, it is largely more educated. Excuse me, one moment. And it is more ready to be active in terms of its values in asserting how indeed a company should be run. So I think this is a very interesting development. You're having the development of not labor and unions the way it developed in the manufacturing eras of many years ago, but what you're having is clusters of people who are now applying their energies, their intellectual energies and their physical energies in ways in which I think they represent perhaps a nucleus, a kernel of what may be happening in many workplaces around the world, at least worthy of note. There are some formations of labor organizations as well that are somewhat surprising as well. But nevertheless, the employee involvement in their workplaces is something that is certainly impacting the future of corporate social responsibility. We could move on to the third stream.
So,
is that okay?
this excuse me, John. So this employees' voice is becoming more active, and then corporation has to address social issue and becoming more activist in some way. This is what
Yes.
you.
Yes. The distinction, I guess, is that in the past, companies, corporations have been reactive to outsiders, to the organizations formed around issues for progress in certain issues, according to, their judgment as to what that action should take. Now we're seeing that at least there is some reason to believe that a certain type of employee feels emboldened to, first of all, decide where he or she is going to work. So we're talking about recruitment, and we're also talking about retention, which can be a cost to business in terms of turnover of employees, if indeed you have a dissatisfied workforce. So it's that internal pressure that I would suggest is relatively new on social issues.
Okay, thank you. Please go on with the third point so we can.
Okay, so customers and consumers and the supply chain, excuse me, are also very, very important in our discussion, it seems to me. I mean, what we're looking at is, first of all, younger customers or consumers especially seem to be, at least this is a generality, but I think it's justified, seem to be more socially conscious. There are polls that indicate that consumers weigh very heavily a company's corporate social responsibility, reputation, and activities. Things like companies, there's a subject called brands taking stands, where indeed on social issues, at least in this country, for example, on controls of guns and on harassment and other things of that kind, consumers at least keep that in mind or raise the issue before they make a decision on purchase. Now, I believe some of those polls are really hyperbolic. I've seen numbers that consumers, 60% or 50% of consumers are integrating that kind of consideration very centrally. I believe the number is more, could be, if it can be ascertained, is more like perhaps 10 or 20%, but growing, and certainly growing among the generations that will inherit the earth. So I think that's a very significant aspect of the future of corporate social responsibility. So as a result, many companies are being active in terms of cause-related marketing, for example, allying with various causes to combat some of the issues, some of the social issues that are certainly troublesome, especially in the health area and so forth. So consumers are very important. There are even some companies that are insisting that their CSR policies be instituted and activated in their supply chain, so that they are having an effect down the line in terms of contractors, subcontractors, and so forth. There is that activity as well. I think that in the time remaining, and there isn't a lot of time remaining, we should certainly address the fact that all of this represents, as I said at the outset, both an opportunity and a challenge for those of us who are in public relations as a profession, and as for educators as well in our profession, and for the students who are going to join us in the profession. And it goes to the ambition, I think, that has long been within our profession to be strategic counselors as well as communications tacticians, as it were, because obviously the input that public relations can deliver and professionals can deliver with their ability at two-way communications and two-way listening, and bringing the issues that seem to be not only present but on the horizon that must be addressed in this regard. This is almost a unique role to operate at the border, as it were, of the organization and its various publics and shareholders and stakeholders, of course. And so if we're going to accept that opportunity, it seems to me that we need to be thinking about where CSR might be heading or should be heading in this troublesome 2020s that I talked about at the outset. And my thought is that this is a time when we can stop briefly, take a deep breath, and look at how CSR can further mature in terms of being a genuine actor and an achiever in social progress. And there are a couple of things that occur to me, and one is that there must be a consistency developed in a company or a corporation between its CSR ambitions and activities in the field, as it were, with the three constituencies that I talked about and other stakeholders as well, and the way it interacts with government. Because with all of the fine progress that is being made, for example, on climate change, with individual companies and investors moving ahead to take action and to proclaim the need for action on climate change, unless governments truly act on that issue, and companies are consistent in what they say in the field and in their, for example, government relations and lobbying efforts, then there is a disconnect to some degree in terms of the degree of progress that a company can make in that regard. So I would suggest that CSR needs, and the participants, the practitioners, and certainly the public relations people and communications people need to think in terms of how that connection, that consistency can be achieved. Not easy, because there are some natural internal conflicts in terms of what a company is doing with the stakeholders and its government relations. But nevertheless, I do think that inconsistency has to be addressed. I also think that the problems, the turbulence that we're going to be operating in the coming year and years cannot be ignored. I mean, we're facing social media, which I feel is the genie out of the bottle right now. We're facing the matter of truth being undermined and questioned. There is the vast we versus them divisions that have taken place in so many places around the world. So we're looking at a future that is going to be very challenging, but nevertheless one that is a great opportunity, because it brings to our profession the opportunity, as I say, to address these things as strategic counselors, to try to solve some of the very, very difficult questions that companies are going to have to face in the next few years. So with that, I will rest my case and be happy to respond.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you very much, John, because all the topic that you touched are very interesting and should be faced by all of us. One question regarding the measurement of CSR. You were during the preparation of this talk, you were telling me that there is, among the investors that you were mentioning, need to measure the CSR in the companies in order to have some criteria, no, to invest in companies. Can you add some words regarding measurement?
Measurement of CSR is very, very central because especially with investors and others, but with investors, they're interested in trying to put a value on tangibles. These are often intangibles. And so there are efforts, for example, by and Tony is very aware of this, the Integrated Reporting Council to put values on many of these intangibles. But for the further success and growth of CSR, there has to be that kind of progress in order to satisfy, for example, insurance companies who are risk management experts. But right across the board, for investors especially, what indeed are we achieving and how can that be translated in some fashion to value for a company and for its investors? Now, for a long time, the intangibles have appeared on balance sheets as soft assets. If you look at, say, a company like Coca-Cola, its soft assets, which mean its reputation, its brand, and so forth, these soft assets are rated even more highly than its hard assets. So there is reason to believe that there are channels to be explored in terms of successful and meaningful measurement of the impact of CSR activity.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to say that also our president from Ferpi is connected and make her regards to you. I want to thank John on behalf of Ferpi, on behalf of the participants, and I will send you, if you are okay with it, I will send you the registration of this webinar that has been very rich of content. And thank you again, and Merry Christmas.
Biagio, may I add one thing quickly?
Sure.
Okay, as I said at the outset, we have only run the top line on this vast subject. I'd be happy to respond to anybody by email subsequently in the days ahead if we didn't get to questions or topics that they're interested in.
Absolutely. So I will give your email to our participants.
Great.
Thank you very much, John. Goodbye and have a nice day.
You too.
Grazie a tutti per aver seguito questo webinar. Ci sentiremo a gennaio per i prossimi e spero sia stato di vostro interesse. Arrivederci.
Arrivederci.